The drone operator didn't expect to find anything unusual that morning in September 2022. He was surveying abandoned properties in rural Nebraska for a real estate developer, watching the live feed as his quadcopter glided over collapsed barns and overgrown fields. Then the farmhouse came into view. From above, the Garrett property looked like 1,000 other forgotten homesteads scattered across the Midwest. Peeling white paint, sagging porch, windows dark as empty eye sockets. But when the operator reviewed the thermal imaging footage later that evening, he saw something that made his hands go cold. Beneath the collapsed root cellar behind the house, the heat signature revealed a pattern that shouldn't exist, not in an abandoned building, not after 14 years. The local sheriff's department received the footage on a Tuesday. By Friday, 3 excavation teams were on site. What they unearthed over the following weeks would finally explain why the Garrett family, Michael, Sarah, and their 2 children, vanished without a trace in October 2008, and why their disappearance had haunted the small community of Ashford for over a decade. But before we dig into what was found beneath that Nebraska soil, we need to go back. Back to when the Garretts were just an ordinary family looking for a fresh start. Back to the summer of 2008, when they first saw the farmhouse listing and thought they'd found paradise. Because what happened to them didn't begin with their disappearance. It began months earlier with a series of small, strange incidents that each of them dismissed as coincidence. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and the dark secrets hidden in America's rural past, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us, would you move into an isolated farmhouse with a mysterious history? Let's find out what really happened to the Garretts. The farmhouse stood 3 miles outside Ashford, Nebraska, at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained. Michael Garrett first saw the property in July 2008, driving out alone while Sarah was at work and the kids were at summer camp. The listing photos hadn't done it justice, the realtor claimed, though in retrospect, that should have been Michael's first warning. Properties that look better in person than in photographs are rare. Properties that realtors are eager to show are usually desperate sells. But Michael wasn't thinking about red flags that afternoon. He was thinking about the price, $75,000 for 4 bedrooms, 2 acres, and a century-old structure that, despite its age, still had good bones. In 2008, even in rural Nebraska, that was a steal. He was thinking about Sarah's dream of leaving Omaha, of raising their children somewhere they could see stars at night and breathe air that didn't taste like exhaust. He was thinking about how proud she'd be when he surprised her with this. The house was a classic American farmhouse, built in 1904 according to county records. White clapboard siding, though much of the paint had weathered to gray. A wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern corner, black shutters that hung crooked on their hinges. Behind the main structure stood a barn that leaned dramatically to the left, looking like it might collapse in the next strong wind, and beyond that, a smaller outbuilding the realtor identified as a root cellar. Previous owners were the Hendricks family, the realtor explained as they walked the property. Owned it for 60 years before moving into town. They're elderly now, needed something closer to medical facilities. Property's been empty about 8 months. Why so long on the market? Michael asked. The realtor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Michael should have recognized the pause of someone choosing their words carefully. It's the location. 3 miles is too far for some folks. No cell service out here either. And you know how people are about old houses. They want modern, turnkey. This place needs work, no question. Michael toured the interior, noting the original hardwood floors, the farmhouse sink in the kitchen, the stone fireplace in the living room. The house smelled of dust and abandonment, but nothing worse. No water damage, no signs of rodent infestation. The bones, as the realtor had promised, were good. I'll talk to my wife, Michael said, but he was already mentally preparing his pitch. Sarah had been talking about leaving the city for 3 years. This was their chance. Sarah said yes that same evening. By August, they'd closed on the property. By September, they were moving in. The first night in the farmhouse, Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of amber and rose. "It's perfect," she whispered to Michael. "It's everything I wanted." Neither of them noticed the root cellar door behind the house, how it didn't quite sit flush with the ground, how something seemed to have disturbed the soil around its frame recently, despite the property being vacant for months. Neither of them heard the sound of settling earth, like something underneath shifting in its sleep. They were too busy being happy. That would change soon enough. The Garrett family settled into rural life with surprising ease. 10-year-old Emma adapted to her new school in Ashford within days, making friends with the confidence of a child who'd been raised to believe the world was safe. 7-year-old Jake was quieter, more observant, but he seemed content exploring the property, turning the barn into his private kingdom where he'd spend hours building elaborate forts from old hay bales and discarded lumber. Sarah began the renovations she'd been planning since they'd first seen the house. New paint throughout the interior, sanded and refinished floors. She tackled each room methodically, transforming the house from abandoned relic to warm family home. Michael commuted to his job in Omaha 3 days a week, a drive he didn't mind because he knew he was coming home to something peaceful. It was late September when the first strange incident occurred, though at the time, it seemed like nothing more than a minor mystery. Sarah was working in the master bedroom, painting the walls a soft gray, when she heard Jake calling from downstairs. "Mom! Mom, come look!" She found him standing in the kitchen, pointing at the farmhouse sink. The water was running, though no one had turned it on. More precisely, the water was running rust red, like old pipes bleeding their corrosion into the basin. "Did you turn this on?" Sarah asked. "No, I just came in from outside and it was going." Sarah turned the faucet off, then on again. Clear water flowed normally. She ran it for a full minute, watching for any sign of rust or sediment. Nothing but clear, clean water. "Old pipes," she said, more to reassure herself than Jake. "Sometimes they get air bubbles or sediment that works loose. It's normal in houses this age." Jake watched the water with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate why. "It looked like blood," he said quietly. "It was rust, baby. Just rust." But that night, Sarah mentioned it to Michael. "Should we have someone look at the plumbing?" "It's a 100-year-old house," Michael said, echoing her own reasoning. "We knew there'd be quirks. If it keeps happening, we'll call a plumber." It didn't keep happening. The water ran clear for weeks afterward. They forgot about it. The second incident was Emma's. She came to breakfast one morning in early October looking exhausted, shadows under her eyes that Sarah immediately noticed. "Bad dreams?" Sarah asked. Emma nodded, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. "I keep hearing someone walking in the hallway, outside my room, like footsteps going back and forth, but when I open the door, nobody's there." "Old houses settle," Michael said. "Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. It can sound like footsteps." "It doesn't sound like settling," Emma insisted, with the firmness of a child who knows she's being placated. "It sounds like someone pacing, like they're worried about something." Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance over their daughter's head. "We'll check the hallway tonight," Sarah promised. "Maybe there's a loose board we can fix." They found nothing wrong with the hallway. The floors were solid, recently refinished, no loose boards anywhere. But Emma's dark circles persisted for days, until eventually she stopped mentioning the footsteps. Sarah asked once if the sounds had stopped, and Emma just shrugged and said, "I got used to them." That should have worried Sarah more than it did. A child shouldn't have to get used to phantom footsteps in her own home. But they were busy with renovations, with settling into new routines, with the 1,000 small adjustments that come with a major life change. It was easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize. The third incident involved Michael, and it was the first one that genuinely frightened him, though he downplayed it when telling Sarah. He'd been working late in Omaha and didn't get home until nearly midnight. The house was dark, except for the porch light Sarah always left on for him. He parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment in the silence, watching the farmhouse. Their farmhouse. Their dream. Then he saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. Emma's room. A silhouette stood at the glass, perfectly still, looking down at him. Michael's first thought was concern. Was Emma awake? Having more nightmares? He got out of the car and waved, but the figure didn't respond. Didn't move at all. Just stood there, watching. By the time Michael got inside and climbed the stairs, Emma's room was empty. She was asleep in her bed, covers pulled up to her chin, breathing with the deep rhythm of undisturbed sleep. The window was closed, curtains drawn. Michael told himself he'd seen a trick of shadows and moonlight. Old houses create optical illusions. His tired eyes had conjured something that wasn't there. He didn't sleep well that night. And he didn't tell Sarah about the figure in the window for another 2 weeks. Not until after the Garretts stopped being able to pretend that something wasn't deeply wrong with their dream farmhouse. The escalation happened in mid-October, 3 weeks before the Garretts would vanish completely from recorded history. Sarah was the first to find the photographs. She'd been sorting through boxes in the attic, looking for their Halloween decorations, when she discovered an old shoebox tucked behind the insulation in the far corner. Inside were perhaps 30 photographs, all black and white, all showing the farmhouse and its surrounding property at various stages over the decades. Most were ordinary. Family portraits on the porch, children playing in the yard, the barn before it began to lean. But 3 photographs made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. They showed the root cellar. In the first, from what appeared to be the 1940s, based on the clothing styles, a man stood beside the cellar door holding a shovel. His expression was grim, almost frightened. The second photo, possibly from the 1960s, showed the cellar door chained shut, a new padlock gleaming in the sunlight. The third photo was darker, grainier, and showed something that Sarah initially thought was a shadow on the ground near the cellar. But the longer she looked, the more it resembled a stain, a large, dark stain that had soaked into the earth. She brought the photos to Michael that evening. Did the realtor mention anything about the root cellar? About why it was sealed? Michael studied the images. No, why would they? These photos, something happened there. Something bad enough that someone felt the need to chain it shut. Sarah, we don't know what these photos mean. Could be anything. Could be the cellar was structurally unsafe. Could be they were storing something valuable and wanted it locked. Look at this man's face, Sarah insisted, pointing to the first photograph. Does he look like someone securing valuables? He looks terrified. Michael wanted to dismiss her concern, but he couldn't quite manage it. The man in the photograph did look afraid, and the stain in the third image, if that's what it was disturbingly large. I'll call the previous owners, Michael said. The Hendricks family. They might know the history. He called the next morning. An elderly woman answered, identified herself as Martha Hendricks. When Michael asked about the root cellar, the phone line went silent for so long he thought the call had dropped. Mrs. Hendricks? You need to leave that cellar alone, she said finally, her voice thin and strained. Don't open it. Don't go near it. Just leave it be. Why? What's down there? Nothing's down there. That's not the point. Some places are closed for good reason, and you don't question the reason, you just respect it. That's what my husband's father told us when we bought the place in 1948, and that's what I'm telling you now. Mrs. Hendricks, if there's something dangerous, I've said all I'm going to say. You seem like a nice family. You have children, the realtor mentioned. For their sake, leave that cellar alone. She hung up before Michael could respond. He shared the conversation with Sarah, who immediately wanted to leave. This is wrong, Michael. That woman was genuinely frightened. We should sell, cut our losses, go back to Omaha. And tell potential buyers what? That the root cellar might have a mysterious history we know nothing about? That'll definitely help with resale value. Michael ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. Look, we've invested everything in this place. Our savings, our dreams. We can't just walk away because of some cryptic warning from an old woman and a few vintage photographs that might mean nothing. They argued for hours. Sarah wanted to leave immediately. Michael insisted they were overreacting. In the end, they compromised. They'd stay, but they'd avoid the root cellar entirely. They'd focus on the house, on their family, on making this work. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of them, and like most compromises built on fear rather than understanding, it solved nothing. Because the root cellar, they would discover, had no intention of being ignored. 3 days after Martha Hendricks' warning, Jake went missing. Not permanently, not yet. But for 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon, Sarah couldn't find her son anywhere on the property. She searched the house, the barn, called his name until her voice went hoarse. She was about to call the sheriff when she heard Jake's voice, distant and strange, calling back to her. She found him standing in front of the root cellar, his hand on the padlock that secured the door. "Mom," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Someone's calling me. From down there. They want help." Sarah grabbed her son and pulled him away from the cellar, her heart hammering. "There's no one down there, Jake. It's been sealed for decades." "Then why can I hear them?" Jake asked, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah didn't have an answer. She took Jake inside, called Michael, told him they needed to talk. That night they made a decision. They would open the root cellar, not because they wanted to, but because ignoring it clearly wasn't working. Whatever was down there, whatever history the property held, they needed to know. They would open it on Saturday morning when they were all home, when they could face it together as a family. Saturday was October 25th, 2008. The last day anyone would see the Garrett family alive. To understand what happened on October 25th, we need to step away from the Garretts and look at the history they'd unknowingly inherited with their farmhouse. Because the root cellar's secret didn't begin in 2008 or even in 1948 when the Hendricks family was warned to leave it sealed. The truth went back much further, to the winter of 1919, and to a man named Thomas Ashford, the same Ashford for whom the town was named. Thomas Ashford built the root cellar in 1905, a year after the main house was completed. Root cellars were common in that era, essential for storing vegetables through Nebraska's harsh winters. The Ashford family used it regularly for nearly 14 years. Then, in January 1919, Thomas sealed it shut and refused to speak of it again. Local records from that period are sparse, but a few newspaper clippings from the Ashford Weekly Gazette paint a disturbing picture. In December 1918, Thomas's eldest son, William, disappeared. He was 16 years old, healthy, with no reason to run away. A search party combed the property and surrounding area for days. They found nothing. 3 weeks later, Thomas's wife, Margaret, reported hearing William's voice calling to her from somewhere on the property. She insisted it came from underground, from beneath their feet. Thomas dismissed her claims as grief-induced delusion, but others heard it too. A neighbor who came to offer condolences reported hearing a young man's voice, faint and desperate, seeming to emanate from near the root cellar. In late January, Thomas ordered the cellar sealed. He filled it with concrete, or so he claimed, though later evidence would suggest otherwise. The Weekly Gazette reported that Margaret Ashford was committed to the state asylum in February 1919, diagnosed with melancholia and auditory hallucinations. She died there 6 months later. Thomas sold the property in 1920 and left Nebraska entirely. The house changed hands several times over the following decades. Each owner reported strange sounds near the root cellar. Each owner, after a period ranging from 3 to 7 years, sold the property and moved away. None would speak publicly about their reasons for leaving. The Hendricks family purchased the farmhouse in 1948 from a widower named Robert Morrison, who'd owned it for only 18 months. Robert's wife had died in 1947, and though the death certificate listed natural causes, local rumors suggested otherwise. Robert allegedly told the Hendricks that his wife had become obsessed with the root cellar, convinced that something, or someone, was trapped beneath it. She'd spent her final weeks trying to dig through the sealed door, working with her bare hands until her fingers bled. Robert's father-in-law, who'd helped clear out the property after his daughter's death, took Gerald Hendricks aside during the sale and delivered the warning that would echo through the decades. Leave that cellar sealed. Don't question it. Don't investigate. Just leave it alone. Gerald and Martha Hendricks followed that advice for 60 years. They never opened the cellar. They avoided it. When their children asked about it, they deflected. When their grandchildren played near it, they called them away sharply. They lived peacefully on the property, raised their family, and never experienced anything supernatural or unusual because they respected the boundary their predecessors had established. But boundaries only work when they're maintained, and the Garretts, lacking the context of the property's history, were about to break a seal that had held for nearly 90 years. On the morning of October 25th, Michael Garrett walked to the old barn and retrieved a pair of bolt cutters. The padlock on the root cellar was old but still solid. It took him 3 attempts to cut through the hardened steel. When the lock finally gave way, it fell to the ground with a sound like a small bell tolling. Sarah stood several feet back, holding both children close. "Maybe this is a mistake," she said. "We need to know," Michael replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "If there's something down there, something that's causing these problems, we need to know what it is." The cellar door was wooden, swollen with age and moisture. It took Michael's full strength to pull it open, the hinges screaming in protest. A smell emerged immediately, not decay, not exactly, but something ancient and disturbed, like soil that hadn't been exposed to air in generations. Stone steps descended into darkness. Michael took out his flashlight, the beam cutting through shadow to reveal a small chamber below, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were stone. The floor appeared to be packed earth. And in the center of that floor was something that made Michael's blood run cold. A depression. A human-shaped depression, as if something had been buried there and then removed, leaving behind only the outline of where it had been. The soil inside the depression was darker than the surrounding earth, stained black with something that might have been organic decomposition, or might have been something else entirely. "Dad!" Jake's voice was small behind him. "Dad, someone's down there." "No one's down there, son. It's been sealed for—" "Dad, I can hear him. He says he's been waiting. He says we need to help him come up." Michael spun around to find Jake staring past him into the cellar, his eyes unfocused, his expression slack. Sarah was shaking her head, backing away, pulling Emma with her. "Michael, close it. Close it now." Michael turned back to the cellar, intending to do exactly that, and saw something that stopped his heart. In the depression in the floor, the soil was moving. Not dramatically, not like something burrowing up from below, but shifting slightly. As if something underneath was breathing. He slammed the door shut, but he knew immediately it was too late. Whatever had been contained in that cellar, whatever had been sealed away for nearly a century, had been disturbed. The boundary was broken. That night, Emma sleepwalked for the first time in her life. Sarah found her standing at the back door at 2 a.m, trying to unlock it, whispering something over and over. When Sarah got close enough to hear, the words made her skin crawl. "He wants us to bring him up. He's been down there so long. He wants us to bring him up." The Garretts didn't sleep the rest of that night. They huddled together in the living room, every light in the house blazing, and planned their departure. They would leave at first light, Sarah insisted. They would go to a hotel in Omaha, put the house back on the market, take whatever loss they had to take. Michael, finally, agreed. But dawn never came. Not for the Garretts. The Garretts had opened it, and once opened, there was no closing it again. The investigation into the Garrett family's disappearance began on October the 27th, 2008, when Emma failed to show up for school and Sarah didn't arrive for her shift at the library in Ashford. Sarah's mother, calling from Omaha, couldn't reach anyone at the farmhouse. The phone rang endlessly, unanswered. She called the sheriff's office, and Deputy Marcus Webb drove out to check on them. He found the house empty. Not ransacked, not disturbed, just empty. The beds were made. Breakfast dishes sat clean in the drying rack. The television was on in the living room, tuned to a morning news program. 2 coffee cups sat on the kitchen table, still half full, the coffee long since cold. Sarah's purse was on the counter. Her wallet and phone inside Michael's truck was parked in the driveway. Everything suggested a family that had simply vanished mid-morning, stepping out of their lives like actors leaving a stage. Deputy Webb called for backup. By afternoon, Sheriff Tom Porter had initiated a full missing persons investigation. Search teams combed the property for 3 days. They searched the house, the barn, the surrounding fields. They dragged the small pond half a mile from the property, though it seemed unlikely 4 people would have drowned there. They interviewed neighbors, though the nearest occupied house was 2 miles away. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. On the 3rd day of the search, a state police investigator named Karen Phillips asked about the root cellar. Deputy Webb led her to it, and they found the padlock cut exactly as Michael had left it 2 days earlier, though the investigators had no way of knowing that. They opened the door cautiously, expecting the worst. The cellar was empty. Just stone walls, packed earth floor, and that depression in the center that Phillips noted in her report as possibly an old root storage pit. Purpose unknown. She saw no signs of recent disturbance, no evidence of violence, nothing that suggested the cellar had any connection to the family's disappearance. What she didn't see, because she had no reason to look for it, was the soil. If she'd brought a forensic team to analyze that dark depression in the floor, they would have found something remarkable. The soil wasn't just stained with decomposition. It was layered, like geological strata, each layer representing a different time period. The deepest layer contained traces of human remains dating back approximately 90 years. The layer above that contained fabric fibers consistent with women's clothing from the 1940s. The next layer contained synthetic materials, not common until the 1960s. And the topmost layer, the freshest disturbance in that soil, contained microscopic traces of DNA that would have matched the Garrett family had anyone thought to look. The investigation continued for 6 weeks. The FBI became involved briefly, suspecting foul play, but without bodies or evidence of violence, they had nothing to pursue. Michael's bank accounts were untouched. Sarah's phone records showed no unusual activity in the days before they vanished. There were no signs of planning, no indication they'd intended to disappear. The case went cold by Christmas 2008. Sarah's mother refused to accept that they were gone, maintaining for years that they'd simply walked away to start fresh somewhere else, though she could never explain why they'd abandoned their truck, their money, their entire lives. She hired private investigators, posted on missing persons websites, never stopped searching. The farmhouse sat empty. It returned to the bank eventually, foreclosure proceedings complicated by the missing persons case. It went on the market again in 2010, priced even lower than before. No one bought it. It went back on the market in 2012, then 2015, then 2018. The price dropped each time until eventually the bank stopped trying to sell it at all. The house decayed slowly over 14 years. The porch collapsed. Windows broke. The barn finally gave up its long fight with gravity and fell in on itself. Nature reclaimed the property, weeds and wild grass swallowing the yard, vines crawling up the siding. The root cellar remained sealed. After the investigation, Sheriff Porter had installed a new padlock, perhaps out of some instinctive recognition that it should remain closed. That padlock rusted over the years, but it held. Until September 2022, when the drone operator's footage showed something that shouldn't have been possible. The thermal imaging revealed heat beneath the collapsed root cellar. Not ambient ground temperature, but specific heat signatures, multiple sources, arranged in a pattern that suggested form and structure. The kind of heat that comes from biological activity, from bodies. The excavation team that arrived 2 weeks later was led by forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Santos. She'd worked on hundreds of burial sites, examined countless sets of remains. She thought she'd seen everything. She was wrong. They removed the cellar door carefully, documenting every step. The stone steps were still intact, though partially collapsed. The chamber below was smaller than they'd expected, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet now that the walls had settled. And in the center, in that depression that had been noted in the 2008 investigation report, they found the remains. Not 4 bodies, not even close. Dr. Santos would later estimate, based on the fragments and layers of decomposition, that at least 12 individuals were buried in that small space, layered one atop another like archaeological strata. The earliest remains dated to approximately 1919. The most recent were from 2008. Among those recent remains, DNA analysis would confirm were Michael, Sarah, Emma, and Jake Garrett. But it was the arrangement of the bones that disturbed Dr. Santos most. They weren't randomly scattered or carelessly buried. They were positioned deliberately, each set of remains oriented the same way, facing upward, arms at sides, legs together, as if each person had laid down willingly and waited as if they'd gone peacefully into the earth. The only exception was the oldest set of remains at the very bottom of the depression. These bones showed signs of violent trauma, evidence of a struggle. A young man, the forensic analysis confirmed, approximately 16 years old, dead for over a century. William Ashford, though they'd never be able to prove it definitively, the excavation made national news briefly, then faded from public attention. The property was declared a crime scene, though no living person would ever be charged. The investigation remains technically open. The official cause of the Garrett's deaths listed as undetermined circumstances, possible homicide. But those who worked the excavation, who studied the site and the remains, they know the truth that they'll never put in an official report. The Garretts didn't die by violence. They didn't suffer. They simply descended into the root cellar one night, laid down in that depression in the floor, and let the earth take them, just like the others before them. Just like William Ashford had in 1919, though his descent had been far less willing, whatever was in that cellar, whatever Thomas Ashford had inadvertently released or created or disturbed in 1919, it had waited patiently through the decades, calling to those who lived above it, pulling them down one by one. The only families who'd survived were the ones who'd respected the boundary, who'd listened to the warnings and left the cellar sealed. The farmhouse, demolished in early 2023, was deemed too contaminated to be habitable due to a tragic history. Heavy machinery reduced it to rubble within a day, and the root cellar was filled with concrete, preventing any future access. Previously marked by a historical marker that was frequently vandalized, the property is now just an empty field, indistinguishable from many others in rural Nebraska. The story of the Garrett family, however, endures in true crime and paranormal discussions online with conflicting theories about their disappearance. While official narratives suggest a serial killer or unknown perpetrator, the evidence does not support these claims, as there were minimal signs of violence on remains found. Aside from William Ashford's security footage, revealed Sarah's car passing a gas station but later found in the driveway, indicating the family did not willingly return home. Dr. Santos, a forensic anthropologist who retired in 2024, expressed her belief that a significant event occurred in the root cellar in 1919, which created a psychic wound that drew certain individuals in. She suggested that families who respected the cellar's warnings survived, while those who ventured into it met mysterious fates. The ongoing case remains open, yet Sarah's mother, unaware of her fate, passed away in 2021, and relatives maintain that the Garrett family's disappearance was not by their choice. The narrative concludes with a somber lesson about respecting boundaries and the potential dangers of unearthing the past. emphasizing that not all mysteries should be solved.